Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the third of our series of ATP Ride Report webinars, and today we'll be discussing facing industry changes. I hope everybody is having a great Friday. My name is Ashley Poulon. I oversee the tuition reimbursement programs and alumni services for ATP Flight School. We're so happy that you're able to join us today, and this afternoon I'm really excited. Our guest panelist is going to be industry expert Kit Darby, president of Kit Darby Aviation Consulting. He has over 35 years of experience in the aviation industry. He's worked for 3 major airlines, a national airline, as well as an aircraft manufacturer. He has experience as a flight engineer, a first officer, a captain, an instructor pilot, and he's amassed over 24,000 hours flown as a pilot and another 7,000 hours teaching in simulators for Boeing and Delta. Kit, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
So if you've tuned into some of our webinars before, you do know we're just going to go over the housekeeping real quick. Your microphones will be muted for the duration of the session. Please utilize the chat box in the lower right-hand corner to communicate with us if you need us to either slow down, speak up, or repeat anything. And we will leave a few minutes at the end of the webinar to allow for Q&A. So there is a separate box for Q&A. Feel free to type your questions for Kit there, and we'll go over them at a later point. And finally, for this week, we actually have 2 polls just to get to know a little bit more about you, our audience. So I'm going to launch one of them now. The first one, since we are discussing facing industry changes today, we'd just like to know, how long have you been a pilot? It'll take a couple seconds to pop up. All right, so we have some just getting started, some over 10 years in the industry. A lot of you voting, awesome. Give you about 10 more seconds to complete that. Perfect, so we have a mix of everyone from just getting started to over a decade in the industry. Awesome. I'll share that with you guys real quick. So you're able to see that. Perfect, all right. And then our second question for you today. We'd also like to find out what your long-term career goals are. So feel free to vote on that also, where you want to end up, airlines, cargo, corporate, let us know. Okay, other, we do have an other. So for the other, let us know in the chat box, what is that job that you're interested in and seeking? Now that we have those answers and know a little bit more about you, our audience, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kit. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. You have mentioned, I had mentioned a brief overview of just the flight portion of your background before, but really your areas of expertise in the aviation industry extend and encompass to so much more than just flying. Can you expand upon that for our viewers and just let us know some of the other facets within aviation that you're involved in?
Certainly. I started out, of course, as a military pilot during Vietnam. I was drafted. I was in Air Force ROTC in a 6-year program with a 4-year deferment. When the 4-year deferment was up, I got drafted, joined the Army, went to aviation flight school, became an instructor, and worked for a few years, waiting for the airlines to recover, because that was always my goal. And when they did, I got out. I got on initially with Braniff. Braniff lasted a couple of years. I got a chance to start over. Along the way, I did Braniff, Capital, United. After I retired from United, I did EOS. I worked for Boeing for 6 or 7 years as an instructor. And now I work for Delta Professional Services in Atlanta. But my real expertise doesn't come from being a pilot. It comes from running an information service that over a 25-year period has had about 200,000 pilot members, different services, newsletters, magazines, resumes, cover letters, job fairs, and we've watched these 200 pilots approach the job market. Some of the things they did worked, some of the things they didn't work. We've learned from them the things that work best and how to run a good job search. So in my own life, I had 25 different interviews with different airlines along the way, got hired most of the time, learned a few lessons myself, and I'm here to share that with our viewers today.
Awesome, thank you. And having that much experience in the industry and having been in it for over 35 years, obviously you've witnessed some ebbs and flows of not only the industry, but the economy as a whole. How did that impact your aviation career?
Well, two big ones. When I was getting ready to get out of the service back in 78, there was a pretty good recession. So I decided to stay in, actually in 77, 76. So I stayed in a little while, about a little more flight experience, a few additional ratings, and got out at what I thought was a good time. And it went to work within 6 months of separating from the service, which that was a good plan. I wasn't very informed back then. I was just reading the broad headlines and decided that getting out in a recession was a bad idea. Later on, after 9/11, which would be the closest to what we have today, a major impact where the airline business was shut down for a little while, then I was in a strange position. I was very high up at United. I was in the top 500 or so. They had pilots furlough off the top. They had pilots at large number that were furloughed off the bottom. And oddly enough, that balanced out, and I stayed right where I was. So I didn't really move. I was number 35 as a captain in Chicago on the 767, and it was all done. I was number 35 as a 767 in Chicago. So I was in the right place. My wife, on the other hand, was a new hire and was furloughed for 3 years off the bottom. So it all happens differently to different people. She, of course, recovered and is back as a United captain today.
You have done studies on, obviously, on when you see air travel returning to normal. Can you speak to some of the data that you use to assess this?
I can. I think I'd like to put a chart up if I could. I'll share my screen here and put up a picture that I can talk about. And give me just a second to select it. There it is. So this is a diagram of what a recovery might look like.
Can you zoom in on that, Kit?
Well, I can't.
Or maybe just share a partial screen.
Oh, is it a partial screen or is that the whole thing?
It's the whole thing right now.
Oh, well, let me try that again. Hit the wrong button. I need advance. There we go. And partial screen.
Perfect. Now we can see it. Thank you.
Try that again. There we go. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm new to the Zoom. All right. So here's a chart that has the years across the top and the months, and it shows a reduction in RPMs, which are revenue passenger miles, how the airlines make money. And we're looking at it taking a pretty steep dive. We would call that if it came right back out, it would be a V. In this case, it's going to stay there for a little while. We're going to call that a U type recovery. So we go down, we stay down for a while until we figure out the virus and either treatments or vaccines or whatever. And then it starts to come back out relatively quickly. And then we get to a point where it settles down and becomes what we call an L shape, or a slower recovery over time. So that is a significant reduction. We're looking at, it's hard to say right now. We don't know how low it's going to go. So we don't know how easily it's going to bounce back. And we don't know how bad it's going to be. So we don't know how long the recovery will be. So this is just the structure of what a recovery would look like without actual values yet. Right now, we're still in the deep decline phase, although it does appear that we've just about bottomed out. And now we will rest there for a while until the airlines can begin to recover. And that is a great unknown at this point. So the good news is that on top of this line that I've shown you, which shows a long recovery period, about 2 years or so, we'll be getting pilot retirements. Significant pilot retirements will cause the need for additional pilots during the recovery period, making the recovery for pilot hiring occur well before the general return to 100%.
And then on our website, you had mentioned a timeline for that growing demand of pilots occurring, and I know you just mentioned that as well, prior to a complete restoration in air travel. Can you share with viewers why that happens first and how many pilots it will take to backfill the yearly pilot retirements prior to COVID-19? And while you're doing that, I'm actually just going to pull up your article on our site.
Share the screen again and hopefully do it right this time, and show you a chart that is an estimate of the retirements. We do have the actual age 65 retirements, which are the major airlines in blue. And this is historical, and then the red line is the current. And these are the future major airline retirements, along with regional airlines, corporate, fractional, smaller other segments. So what that gives us is a baseline of about 4,100 pilots a year that will be retiring that have to be replaced. Now this formula is normally about half growth and half retirement. But in recession, of course, we won't have growth, we'll have only retirement. Later on, when we get back to 100% and the economy is growing again, we'll have both retirements and growth. But the baseline becomes these retirements, which leave at age 65 and don't come back. So we can stack that on top of the recovery in the revenue passenger miles and see that we'll get to a demand for pilots a year or two sooner than the general recovery. So when you put that together over a longer period, this is a 20-year look, but when you combine those airline, regional, corporate, and fractional retirements, and the little red at the top is the early and medicals that occur, you get a cumulative chart that shows 80,000 openings in the next 20 years, which is almost as many airline pilots as we have today.
Perfect. It looks like Randy, oh, hey Randy, he wanted to know and ask you on that previous chart that you had, why may there be a peak? He's looking at it in 2031. It looks like there's just a little bit more, so.
Yes, I'm looking at that, and I don't know if it's inaccurate data. It occurs at UPS. They have a very large retirement in 1 year, and I haven't been able to research that yet. But they go along with a few retirements here and there, and then they have like a couple of hundred in 1 year, which bumps the chart. And I haven't had a chance to. Normally, I look at the actual seniority list and I sort the list by age and get the number of people reaching 65. I haven't done that at UPS. I've done it at most of the other airlines. When I get done, I'll let you know, but that's where that bump is right now. It is circumspect. So Let's see.
Perfect. And Guy, okay. I do also just want to share. Oh, I have another question. Oh, he says, thank you. We're just gonna exit the screen sharing for a second, and I want to share with you guys, if you have questions or would like to view more information on this, Kit actually wrote an article. You can go to our website, atpflightschool.com, and towards the bottom there is a news section, and you can click on this article, COVID-19 and the industry recovery, and it's been written by Kit. And you actually, if you want to review some of these charts or just read the article, you're actually able to do so. They are listed on our website, so if you'd like to review them later, that's where you're able to find that. And Kit, another question that we see a lot is just following up on kind of a common misconception that a large portion of these jobs that are opening will be filled by separating military personnel. And obviously, while these men and women are highly qualified, fixed-wing military pilots do account for a small portion of those pilots that are entering the job market. So can you advise roughly what percentage of airline hiring does come from military pilots?
Well, that percentage back when I was hired, it was 80% military, and that's what everybody seems to remember. But things have really changed. When the requirement came about for so many pilots in the last decade, the military only produces 1,000 or 2,000 pilots a year. So in those years where we're hiring 5,000 pilots, you simply can't fill it with military pilots, meaning that even though they're great candidates and they do get a good shot at the jobs, once they're consumed in a given year, 100% of the additional pilots are going to be civilian pilots. So today that's running 20–25%. It was headed down. It's going to level off during these hard times, no doubt about that. And then when it starts back up, there'll be a pile of military guys that got out in a year or two. So it'll be heavily military to start, but it won't be long before we've consumed those pilots, and it'll be the majority civilian pilots. Long term going forward, I would call civilian pilot background to be at least 80% of the pilots hired at the airlines.
And out of that, I think something that sometimes people don't realize when looking at the military population is not everyone that is a military aviator has a fixed wing experience. And so
that's true. I was an Army pilot, which is barely military, and most of my friends were helicopter pilots. I happen to be a fixed wing pilot in the Army. And recently we've seen these RTP programs where rotary wing pilots have gotten a chance to enter the regional airlines because there was a severe shortage. In general, though, helicopter time is not directly applicable to the airlines. The closer you can get to the type of flying the airline does, large fixed-wing, multi-engine turbine airplanes, the better they like it. So if we have pilots with fixed-wing experience, they've always been preferred over helicopter pilots. Helicopter pilots recently got an opportunity because we were pretty much out of fixed-wing pilots at the regional level.
And that actually brings up, I was going to save it for later, but we did receive a question via email beforehand, and it was from, I believe it was from Jack. And Jack, thank you for your service, first off. He is a military viewer. That he had a question about if the RTP program will still continue. And Jack, I just want to let you know, I have reached out and talked to a couple of recruiters today, and I know Envoy had mentioned that they're still actually processing the paperwork for the RTP program. So there is no threat of that going away anytime soon. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease.
Well, my take on the rotary wing programs, and I have a daughter with a fiance that is a RTP pilot at he's taking his ground school, waiting on his simulator at PSA. So I'm very keen on those and been watching it close. If anything, we have trained the airlines that the helicopter pilot background makes a pretty good airline pilot, and we're going to see that. So I don't know that they'll get the same financial support that they've had in the past. Those programs have been very generous in helping them acquire the ratings and experience they need to transition to fixed wing. That may fall more to the pilot in the future, but we've certainly shown the airlines that a rotary wing pilot, professional rotary wing pilot, can become an effective airline pilot, and how much they pay or help you accomplish that will remain to be seen. But certainly they know. It's sort of the same thing that happened with deregulation. In the old days, we didn't hire older pilots. If you were over 30, 32 years old, you were over the hill. At deregulation, the law required pilots that were displaced to be hired. The airlines hired them, found they make great pilots, and now these age restrictions that we suffered under for many years are gone because the airlines see that older pilots can be integrated successfully into their airline, just like helicopter pilots.
Perfect, thank you. And so far in this webinar, we have really discussed air travel in relation to just the airlines, but there really are so many other sectors in the aviation industry as a whole. In your opinion, how have those been affected?
Well, even the airlines are not going to have the same effect, the different segments. I mean, our legacy carriers, the Delta, United, American, that have many different aircraft types, which causes a lot of expensive training. And they fly almost 50% in some cases of their RPMs overseas. And overseas is going to be a slower recovery from this virus. So they're in and they had, cash reserves, big cash reserves, but they're big airlines. So as a percentage, their cash reserves were not huge. So that segment is the most vulnerable to a slow recovery. Whereas low-cost carriers that might have only one aircraft type, like Frontier, or some of the Alaska with just a couple of types, they have a very limited training. They have mostly a domestic market, and the domestic market is going to recover much quicker. So they're going to benefit from that. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them had a significant cash reserve on a percentage basis. So companies like Alaska and Frontier, Southwest in particular, they're very well positioned to recover differently than just all the airlines in a group. The big question is the regionals. And the last time we had a bad event, 9/11 and a huge recession in 2008, the big airlines decided that they needed to fly all the routes, or most of the routes they had flown in the past, but they found that their larger airplanes were too big for those routes. Those routes were short and thin, didn't have very many passengers. So rather than not fly the route, because if you don't fly the route, the passenger learns to get on some other airline that is flying the route. They learn where to park, they learn the frequent flyer program. They don't easily come back. So it's very important for the big airlines to maintain their routes, even if their airplane is too big. So if their airplane is too big, who's got a smaller airplane? Well, that's the regional airline. So last time, a lot of shorter, thinner routes were displaced to the regionals, and those airlines actually hired and grew through a very bad recession and a very bad period after 9/11. Will that happen again? Too early to tell. I know they're thinking about it, but they haven't done it yet. And until they do, the regionals are a huge question mark. So I'm optimistic. I think they will protect those routes and give additional flying to the regionals, and that will give new pilots a place to begin their career while they're waiting for a full recovery. Right now, it's a guess, however.
Okay. And what about corporate fractional cargo?
But okay, the corporate is so far has a smaller reduction than the airline, so they have a much smaller cutback. The theory being that pilots are flying passengers with wealth. You know, that's obviously an expensive operation, but those wealthy passengers are likely to not want to expose themselves to the medical situation anytime soon. So if they continue to fly their airplanes or use fractional flying to get where they want to go so they're not in the general mix of the population, if they can afford to do that, I believe they will continue to do that, meaning that corporate is likely to be one of the bright spots going forward, cutting less and recovering more quickly than the airlines. Fractionals, of course, would just be part of that. Cargo, I get a lot of questions about cargo. To put cargo in perspective, we need to realize that cargo is only about 10% of the pilots. So I can't tell everybody you're going to be a cargo pilot because everybody's not going to be a cargo pilot. But cargo, thankfully, the boxes don't get sick. They don't get upset when they go through a metal detector. They're an ideal passenger, you know, so they're going to be in a position not only to do well because of the online shipping and stuff that goes with staying at home, but also because they're needed and they're not don't have the same medical issues that a person has. So I think cargo is going to do very well, and it may even grow and hire right through the recession. It's certainly booming right now. No doubt about it, their business has increased, not decreased. So that would be a great place to focus, realizing that it's only 10% of the market. Everybody can't work at a cargo company. Another great place would be military, government contract, that type of thing. A great place to be in a recession is in a government contract or government job. It's much less vulnerable to the ups and downs. If you have a job in that category, you might try to keep it for a while before you transition. If you don't have one and could get one, and there are some contract positions that are going on, the ISR, King Air flying overseas, great way to build flight time, multi-time, to captain's experience. So what's going to happen with that, we don't know, but it's not going to be reduced as much, if at all, and it would certainly carry you through the few years that we need to get back to both growth and retirements. The final thing would be flight instruction. And flight instruction is an exempt area. Flight instruction has continued with a reduction, but nothing like the airlines. So flight instruction could be a great place to continue to build your experience and ratings. We do have to think about new jobs. I mean, if you're moving to an area that's going to be more affected and you get that job, but then it's reduced, then you need to be careful. So if you have a good job, basically, I'm saying you should stay with it. If you don't have the job you want, you need to try to get it right away because the market's going to deteriorate. So if you're in there early, it's time to dust off the resume, time to fill out the online application, time to circle your recommendations and get that job as quick as you can. And if you have a good job, do a good job and stay in that job.
Perfect. All right. And finally, what advice would you like to provide? Could you give our viewers who are facing some of these industry changes right now?
Well, I've been out of the market 5 or 6 times in my career, through no choice of my own, and initially the reductions are you sort of take them personal. You know, you've made a big investment, time and money, and you're hurt personally by the downturn. So that is a very negative response. And I've seen pilots take off 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, just step away. This is not the time to step away. This is the time to step up, because when this thing comes back, and it will come back, when it comes back, the pilots that have continued to fly, that have added to their qualifications and experience, that have gone on to get multi-turbine time and be a captain, they're going to be on the top of the application pile, and there's going to be a pile to start with. So it's very important to be patient and persistent and fight that, you know, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore because some bad things have happened. You need to be tougher than ever and continue flying. I call it staying in the saddle. The number one thing you can do as a pilot is continue to ride that horse. Get the best flying job you can. Now, a lot of times that might mean going back a step. Maybe you just stepped up to a higher level, and that's not going to sustain your job. You go back a level, go back to being a regional pilot, go back to being a flight instructor, go back to being a corporate pilot. That may not seem ideal, but it's usually where your strong resources are. You have a network, you have flight experience there. It's a tremendous thing to be able to go do that, as distasteful as it may be to take a step back. It'd be far better than not having a flying job for a while, to be in that job and building qualifications and experience. It's a tough pill to swallow, but my advice is keep riding the horse.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to share your insight. I know that I speak for all of our attendees when I say that we greatly appreciate it. At this time, we are going to begin the Q&A portion. And we did actually, I know that we answered Jack's question on RTP. We had another one, and I think that Joe had emailed in a couple questions. We addressed most of them, but he also had asked, many airlines obviously took advantage of the CARES Act. Do you think that they'll try to either push to get an extension of that or some type of additional aid come the new fiscal year, so in October?
Well, I do believe they'll push to get additional aid and may well get additional aid. However, this type of aid, when we're basically paying salaries, that's what it's for, and the business is way down. So we can only pay those salaries as long as that aid continues. So let's say they get 6 months, which they have now, or they get an extension, but at some point that's going to run out. I don't believe there's enough money over the long term to sustain the industry back to 100%. So it's going to run out at some point, either now or with some extension, and that's going to place the airlines in a tough situation. There's a lot of things they can do. They can retire pilots early, and at American we had over 600 pilots take that early retirement. Other pilots will elect to retire early on their own, either because they can or because they're not willing to work hard to keep that medical that they need to do toward their end of their career. The other thing is, as time goes by, these pilots will continue to retire. So a lot of things working to offset the excess, but at the same time, I do believe it will run out at some point.
And guys, we are seeing a lot of messages. If you have questions, if you can just place them in that Q&A area, that way we can mark them as answered as we get to them. And Naomi would like to know, do you think the future of autopilot development, how do you think that will play into the industry in the near future?
Well, I'm going to guess that she's talking about replacing pilots with automation. I don't know that I'm an autopilot expert, although I spent a lot of my life on an autopilot. But I'm assuming that we're talking about the automation replacement of pilots, either one or both pilots. And my typical answer to that is that I start out with the life of an airplane. So a narrow body airplane usually has a useful life of 25 years or so, and a wide body airplane more like 30 years. So if you take all the fleet today, none of which is automated, and say, okay, how long would it be before we would introduce a new airplane? Over time, over 25 or 30 years, you could replace those piloted airplanes with pilotless airplanes, but it's certainly going to take a while. And 25 or 30 years is a normal career. So yes, your children may have more of an issue with this than you would, but as a young pilot today, if you're entering the market, by the time we got to significant replacement, if it were to occur, you would be a senior dude and probably not in much risk. It's going to be a transition, a long, slow transition that's got to take at least the length of the current airplanes, 25 to 30 years.
And then Devin had asked, Devin, I can field this one. The cadet programs, yes, they are going to continue. Like I said before, same thing with, I know talking with Envoy, it's one of the airlines that we have a cadet, we are a cadet partner school for. They are still processing those cadet style applications. They're not actually able to do the onboarding process right now with the hiring pause, but I know that is something that they plan on resuming as soon as they are able to continue. So no, we do not see those programs going away.
Actually, if I could comment on that as well, I watch those programs carefully. I review applications and do resumes for young pilots. And these programs, the airlines have developed them not for the short term. They've developed them as a long-term source of pilots. So I know it's crazy to talk about shortage, but there's actually a fear that this downturn will suppress the supply of pilots even further. And not only when we come back with the big retirements, but there'll be a reduction in the production of pilots during the time that we're waiting. And we could actually have a worse shortage when it starts back up than we do today.
And Logan had mentioned just some of the consolidation within the Trans-State holding, and he's just wondering how that would affect hiring. And obviously, Logan, something to think about is a lot of them, there's a third airline, GoJet, that absorbed some, and beyond that, some of the pilots there are captain eligible, so that's something to think about where they would be entering at the market. Maybe Kit, you can speak a little bit more about that.
Well, those 3 airlines are in a group where they were thinking about getting out of the business. And just like an airplane that you're thinking about retiring, now's a good time to retire it. So they've chosen to back away from 2, and we'll have to see what happens with the 3rd. And it's, there's going to be less demand. So having those pilot jobs go away for those particular pilots puts them out in a job market at a tough time. I believe it'll be a tougher time in 6 months or a year. So for them to get reemployed as quickly as possible is important. But I don't think it's a very big event overall. In other words, it's a relatively small percentage of the regional flying that's done. And of course, we have to remember that our major airlines, over half the flights, more than half of the flights and almost a quarter of the people are flown in regional carriers. That is an important part of their business plan. So they can't reach their own goals if the regionals are not successful. And of course, we talked earlier about there may be a desire for them to have the regional airlines fly more of their flying in those routes that are don't have enough passengers. And you think to yourself, well, enough passengers, surely they have 50 people or 150 people a day, but you can't really do 150 people a day with one flight. You could put a 757 on it, fly it once a day, but that's not what the customer wants. The customer wants to step out to the curb like it's a bus and have the bus come by morning, noon, or night. So they go to Chicago, they get done early, they step out to the curb, and there's another flight back to Montgomery or wherever you're going. So they don't want one flight a day, even though it's very efficient to do that. The customer wants convenience. They want to fly that flight 5 times a day, morning, noon, and night. And to do that, you now need a 50, 70, 90 seat airplane, not a 150, 250 seat airplane. So there's really a notch. It's like a pyramid. We have a lot of really smaller airplanes at the bottom, mid-size airplanes in the middle, and jumbo airplanes at the top. And those need to each fit the market they serve. If you're going hub to hub, you can have a jumbo jet. If you're going from Montgomery to Chicago, you're going to be needing to fill no more than 50, 70 seats.
Okay. And our next question, it looks like, Alex, you are 31 years old with a master's in electric engineering, considering a second career. You are definitely not too, Kit touched on this a little bit before, but you are definitely not too old to make that jump to the airline. And
True.
He also had a question about, will he be viewed as a more attractive candidate to recruiters because he has a technical background?
Well, they do like a technical background, although it's not required. So at the regional level, especially recently where they were really desperate for pilots, lots of people have gotten in with all types of degrees or no degree. However, I would have to encourage you to have a degree. Past the 4-year degree, though, the advanced degree doesn't bring a huge advantage. Now, the technical degree is going to stand you well in training. It'll be desirable in the interview, but it's not required. So it's more important to finish on time and make good grades in school than it is to have a technical degree. It could be journalism if you finish on time and make good grades. If you go to a really tough school, they understand. If you're going to MIT or Stanford or somewhere and you don't have the best GPA, that's okay. But if you get a GPA below 3, they're looking at it. If you get below 2.5, you need to have a good reason. So really important to finish on time and make good grades. The technical part is an advantage, but it's a minor one compared to having a low GPA or going to a less competitive school, that type of thing.
Okay, perfect. And our next question, oh, this is from John. John, he recently completed the program with us. Hey, John, do you have recommendations for pilots past the general advice that you gave before that are just beginning their career right now during recovery?
Well, if you're just getting started, realize that the reason the airlines like military pilots is they have a verifiable training. You know, they went to a place that they know what they do, military flight school. They know how hard it is. They know everything about it, and they have verifiable records of it. So they bring to them both good training and records. Well, the more that your training can look like that, the better. So they like verifiable records. They like schools like ATP that don't do anything but create airline pilots. You can't rent an airplane. You can't go somewhere. You're going to go there for the sole purpose of becoming a professional pilot. They like that. And they're becoming more and more aware of quality professional schools and giving them credit and working with them, as we're starting to see with some of the big three now starting to work with third-party schools to deliver quality candidates, not just to the regionals, but eventually to the large major airlines.
And our next question, oh, this person is anonymous. Do you think that the FAA will change the regulations to meet pilot demands, such as either hiring requirements with the 1,500-hour rule or retirement ages?
Okay, well, two questions. The 1,500-hour rule is it's a mess. I mean, it was done by the Congress, which has almost no aviation experience or expertise. Consequently, it can only be changed by the Congress. And that rule was initially political. It ignored the expert advice that they received and went with the survivors of the Colgan crash, which were all non-aviation people, and they made them happy with the 1,500-hour rule. However, the FAA is forced to enforce it because it's the law, and only the Congress can change it. So they're working with minor ways, you know, making it a restricted ATP available with lower flight hours. My view on that is there's very few people that in that category, not enough people to fill our needs. So changing it a little bit, lowering it to a little bit less flight time for a military pilot or a 2-year or 4-year school graduate really doesn't solve the problem hardly at all. So I don't think it's going to be much help by lowering that. We don't get a lot of extra pilots. If you fall in that category and can qualify sooner, terrific. The majors have not been hiring restricted ATPs, but it would help you get on with a regional carrier. Now, as far as age 65 retirement, there was a big impetus, and the rule was changed initially because of the demand for pilots. The recession that we're facing is going to cool that demand for a while, so the pressure will be off to raise the retirement age. Will it eventually be raised? Probably. There are countries that have no retirement age that allow you to fly as long as you can get a medical. In the big scheme of things, you know, 10 or 20 years from now, I would expect the whole world to be like that. But right now, I don't think the U.S. will change anytime soon.
Okay, perfect. And then, okay, so Scott is asking about the scope clause and how do you think that that will factor in with the addition of regional flying, being, you know, the regionals taking some flights from majors depending on the load.
Well, scope clauses, that is a highly political hot potato that there may be some compromises made. The large companies and their large unions are very defensive, you know, wanting to keep the flying for their pilots and their planes, and they've drawn a line. It's been a pretty hard line the last few years. However, this is a major event. A major event could cause for some adjustment. Whether the scope clause will be relaxed or not, I do not know. I know that they'll be wanting to relax it, but whether they'll be able to achieve that is hard to say. Like I say, it is a political hot potato. Although in drastic times, often drastic measures are needed. So time will tell.
Thank you. And Paul would like to know how you think the relationship will play out between pilots who are maybe currently employed with low-cost carriers versus heading to a major airline in the future.
Say that again.
So he's just curious with the relationship between maybe some airlines that get labeled as low-cost carriers, and the relationship with them advancing to a major airline. And Paul, let me know if that's what you're.
Well, if you look back over time, 20 years or so, the low-cost carrier has really been growing faster, more consistently than our established airlines. Our established airlines have sort of kept what they had and lost slowly some market share to the. If you're looking, there's two things that will promote you once you're hired: growth and retirement. Retirements we have, you can get that online, see who's going to retire. And again, you're not looking at numbers, you're looking at percentages. You know, if you have 100 pilots and 50 people retire, you're a captain. If you have 10,000 pilots and 50 people retire, you might get a weekend off. You know, I mean, it's just not the same deal. So retirement, the retirements that we're talking about that in that example are really a percentage deal, not a numbers deal. And I lost track on the question.
So he was just, and I think Paul, my opinion on this would be that if you're with one of them right now, you're still in a position where you're flying a much larger aircraft, and that speaks to experience. So that makes you a desirable candidate if and when the time comes for you to want to advance to a major.
Well, I do expert witness work for pilots that are injured or delayed in their career, and I calculate their career value. So I do that for all the airlines, and as well as corporate and military. And as I make these calculations, there was sort of a second class of major airline. There were the majors, the big three, and FedEx, UPS, really big paying airlines. And then there were second class citizens, the smaller major airlines, Frontier, JetBlue, Allegiant, Spirit. They just weren't the same. They didn't have the same career value, didn't have the same retirement. Well, as I made those calculations over the last 10 years or so, those airlines have made tremendous progress in wage, benefits, and retirement. Now, they're not 100% of the large big three or big five, but they're most of it. They're 85% with an excellent retirement, whereas the Delta, United, American have a 16% company paid retirement. These other airlines are 14, 15, 16% too. So I no longer place those as second class citizens. I would say if you have a job at a low-cost major airline, you should re-examine that. That may well be a career position.
Okay. Neil would like to know how you see business travel returning to normal with the rise of what we're doing right now, online Zoom meetings during the shutdown.
Well, they thought faxing was going to kill air travel at one point too. So, at some point in a transaction, there's a need to be face-to-face. You're right. It could be some meetings could take place that would normally be travel. But the thing is, because of the automation, we do more business overall, and there's still an increasing percentage of air travel. So I don't see, even though we'll get a good lesson in how to do this as we are doing today, I still think air travel will be a strong part of it, both business and pleasure travel. We have trained people to travel. We don't want to get in our car and go down to the coast and in a Winnebago. We've trained people that a nice vacation is to get on a big jet and fly across the ocean and go to Spain or Portugal and go to Mexico or South America. That's not going to change. We have trained both business and pleasure travel to use this product that we have, and that product is an aircraft seat that's bolted into an airplane, and we get to fly that plane. That becomes a commodity, and I see an increasing demand for that commodity. A little bit less, more or less, in hard times or good times, but it's been a 5% compounded growth rate for the last 25 years, and I believe it will maintain that.
And we do have a viewer that was out of the industry for 15 years and was getting ready to start their flight review and get current. He said he is 54 with 3,900 hours, 1,000 turbine PIC, has some 91 and 135 experience. What do you think is the best route to get back in? He's been looking at regionals and some fractional ownership.
Well, welcome back. Not the longest time out I've ever heard. I talked to lots of people over the past 10 years or so that are career changers or returning. I mean, they may have been flying on the side, but not professionally, or they flew professionally and left at some point, a lot of times after 9/11, and now they're back. So the first thing is that there's more to it than just the currency you're talking about is FAA currency, takeoffs and landings, instrument approaches, and you certainly need that. But there is also professional currency. So you can't expect to get full credit for your past experience without becoming a full-time professional pilot. And it's hard sometimes because perhaps you have a good job or you're making good money doing something else. But at some point, you're going to have to transition to full-time flying at the highest level you can. That may be flight instruction or a regional carrier, corporate flying or fractional, whatever it's going to be. We need to get you in an airplane full-time flying. At that point, after a year or so, you'll get credit for your past experience and add that to your current experience. And now you will be a much more competitive candidate. This may take a year or so to get what I would call professionally current. There's another issue. You haven't been doing it professionally. You have some work to do. You have to fly the home simulator. If you go get a job at a regional or any other, they're going to expect you to be ready to go. There's no time to spool you up during training. What they're going to do is try to spool you up, and if you don't spool up, they're going to kick you out. So you need to get ready. Get on the home sim. You'll know when you've got it ready. Then get some flying to go with it. Do the homework. Aeronautical Information Manual, Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators, the regulations. You've got work to do because they're going to be deathly afraid that that big a break is going to make you less capable in ground school, less able to do the things they ask you to do. So you've got work to do. You've got to make real sure you do all these things I'm talking about, and don't be afraid to tell them about it in the interview. Say, look, I've been out a long time. I've done this, this, and this. I am ready for this ground school. I will not disappoint you, and here's why. Laying out that detailed program that you've done to get yourself ready. Because this, the airline ground school, for instance, we joke about it being drinking from the fire hose. It will literally blow you away the first time. I deal with pilots every day that are not prepared for that have had a training failure in their first training event because they just weren't ready for the pace and the quantity of information they were going to have to process. Their instrument skills were not quite there. And believe me, if they're not quite there, you may get a chance to do it again.
And another question, so we kind of went over this, but someone is asking, is your opinion on, is right now the best time to get into a flight school, or should someone wait a year or two?
Well, in that letter you pointed to, I believe the recovery, if I had to make a guess, and it's with only partial information, I would say we're 2 years away from getting back to normal. If your training takes 2 years or 3 years, you have to both train and build experience. So if the training and experience portion of getting you to 1,500 hours takes 2 or 3 years, I think your timing would be excellent to get started right now. It's a gutsy move. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you're probably going to have relatives and parents and spouses saying, I'm not so sure this is a great idea. But when you're going to be smiling, though, when you get hired on an upturn, so as the market returns and you get hired, then you will probably never be furloughed. The people that get hurt in this are the ones that get on at the end of the program. So getting in on the beginning of the program, that is a great place to be. So yes, I think right now is a great time. If you have it set aside, if you can create the time and money to get this done, then finish the job, build the experience. By the time you're ready, the market will be ready for you.
Perfect. And all right, we had someone who had mentioned they don't have a degree yet, and they have done, some career experience and research about becoming a pilot, and that's something that they really want to do. Can you speak to getting started right now versus maybe the options of completing a degree at a later point while you're potentially building time?
Okay, well, you do need both. Some people go to school and learn to fly. Some people learn to fly and go to school. Doesn't really matter which order you do it in. I didn't finish my college until after my Army flight training. So it can be done either way. But before it's done, you're going to have both. Now, the most efficient way to do it, if possible, is to get your flight training, and while you're building experience, go to school. But this takes strong personal willpower. Not everybody is a good student while being a full-time employee. Other people do better as a full-time student. So somehow you've got to get this done. If you want to get it done as quickly as possible, the best thing to do would be get your flight training, and then while you're building experience, complete your college And that's a tough row. I mean, that would take the cooperation of your family. You know, if you're married with kids and all, there's all types of distractions. You've got to have the discipline to do it. But if you can do it, you will get to the end point faster than someone who does it 1, 2, 3.
And Kevin would like to know if it's more desirable in the eyes of legacy carriers, whether you build 1,500 hours as an instructor, or potentially explore, 135 operations like he mentioned, Ameriflight.
Well, some of both. You know, it's good to be an instructor. Smaller airlines have really come to like instructors. They know that you don't really know it till you teach it. So if you've been out teaching it, they know you've got a strong foundation, and they really like that. However, there's a limit. I mean, you don't need 5,000 hours of instructor time, but getting a couple of thousand hours of instructor time, 1,000, 1,500, and moving to the next position, and you really can't move to the next position until 1,500 hours anyway. So 1,200 cargo, 1,500 passenger. So certainly that gap between the end of training and the 12 or 1,500 hours, flight instruction is a great way to do that. It's the way most people do it. There are other things. You can do banner towing, fish spotting, fire spotting, ferrying aircraft. There's a million little things you can do, but most people do it as a flight instructor, and most airlines appreciate the fact that you're going to have a strong foundation having been an instructor. A side note is I've been an instructor my whole life. I did it for the wrong reason. I did it, there was a fuel crisis in the military, and the flight time went way down, but the instructors got to keep flying. So selfishly, I wanted to keep flying. I became an instructor. Turned out I liked it. I found out that the machine was always the same thing. It always did exactly what a machine's supposed to do. But interfacing the pilot to the machine, that was always a challenge. And I'm still enjoying that challenge today.
And so and this is kind of a follow-up on that, but if instructing maybe isn't something that you're interested in doing till 1,500, what would you consider the most desirable other options? So there are, cargo opportunities, corporate. Is there one thing in your experience helping prep that really would stand out to the airlines?
Well, again, the closer we can get to what they do. So multi-engine, turbine, passengers, scheduled, and some of the cargo carriers, FedEx, UPS, have actually previously had a preference for long-range international. These are things that are very hard to do as a beginning pilot, but that is what they like. The higher, the faster, the more motors, the more noise you make, the better they like it. So they like pretty much what you like. So they like the same things that pilots respect. They want to fly a bigger, faster airplane that goes higher and further than the other guy. So normally your instincts will lead you to the right choice doing that. Be careful, however. They also like some pilot and command experience. So if you keep chasing the best co-pilot job and never make captain, that can be a detriment. Some of the airlines, a few, have PIC requirements, but all of them prefer PIC experience. So don't keep chasing the bigger co-pilot position to be a 747 co-pilot when you could have been a captain on a smaller plane. They want to know they're going to hire you to be a captain. You're going to be a co-pilot for a while, but you're going to end up as a captain. And having been a successful captain, having been through training and made those decisions and flown as captain is an important part of your qualification. So in many cases, like at a regional carrier, you could go to the next larger carrier, but if you wait a little bit, you'll be a captain. A year or two of captain experience, that would be my goal for you. If I had to set a goal initially, get qualified, get 1,500 hours. Once you get on the regional, make captain, get 2,000 hours of captain experience. And you're going, wow, 2,000 hours, that's a lot. What I do, when I study the statistics, most people hired have twice the minimums. The highest minimums at the major airlines are 1,000 hours PIC turbine. So I double that. My goal for you, 2,000 hours turbine PIC. You'll probably get hired before that, but if you make a plan to get it, you'll have a good plan. If you don't plan to get it, you could come up short.
All right, guys, and for some of these questions, if you have specific, I see some of them are related to tuition reimbursement. If you are a student at ATP, please feel free, or instructor, please feel free to log into Whiteboard and the contact information and email me. We're going to save this last question for Kit, as he is our guest. And Logan would like to know, so he currently has his associate's degree, and he's just trying to figure out whether or not to add on the 2 years to get the bachelor's. And he knows that, you know, some regionals have those flow, obviously, with the 3 that are flowing to American, have those opportunities that perhaps don't require them. Do you think he should still obtain one?
I do believe you should still obtain a 4-year degree, or certainly be working toward it. I've kept statistics on this in more detail in the past, but when I was doing it in a very detailed manner, the percentages that had 4-year degrees were five of the 11 or 12 airlines require a 4-year degree, so that's 100%. The other half had it in the low 90s, mid 90 percentiles. The pilots that did not have a degree had what we call significant life experience. That means you need a bunch of zeros behind your flight time. So those were people with 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 hours. So it's far easier and better to get a 4-year degree than to try to have significant life experience, which takes a decade. So you really need a 4-year degree. If you're working on it, you might get hired without it, but not to be working on it, that sends a message. If we know the airlines think it's important and you're not even working on it, that means you don't think it's important. And that's a difference between you and what the airline's looking for. So if you have a degree, great. If you don't, you should be working on it. A reminder, by the way, that an ATP at flight schools, at colleges that offer flight training is worth a year and a half of college. So if you have a 2-year degree and an ATP and go to a school, large aviation school that gives credit for flight ratings, you might be only 6 months away from a 4-year degree. So don't fail to realize that your flight ratings have college credit at schools that give flight training as part of the curriculum. It will be worthless at your local community college unless it has a flight program. But if it's Embry-Riddle, UND, you know, then it's going to have real value.
And Logan, something to think about too. I mean, obviously with some of the airlines, it's not required, but it's always good to have, you know, options. And just so if you're maybe where you want to be based changes and you don't want to commute, or there's a lot of factors that it's just gives you additional opportunities.
There are a few other aspects of it too. If say you're in the airline and you want to become an instructor or a manager or work on special projects, that 4-year degree is going to, again, now you're working among other professionals, not pilots. You're competing for those positions among other pilots. So it's a valuable qualification that I encourage you to pursue. If you happen to get hired before you finish it, fine, but not to be working on it would be a mistake.
And Logan said you're welcome, or thank you. So you're welcome, Logan. All right, guys. Well, we are approaching 1 hour. So Kit, we are so grateful that you were able to join us today. Thank you for being here with us. Really quick, well, I'm going to pull up Kit's website just so you guys can see it. If you have additional questions, he can tell you about some of the other services that he provides while I'm getting that pulled up.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
All right, so here is your website. And if you have additional questions, Kit, I know that you mentioned people can reach out to you and contact you, and we actually go to your About Us section. Down here at the bottom, there is contact information for Kit. And Kit, can you tell us a little bit about some of the options that you have with Kit Darby Aviation Consulting?
Well, coming into a downturn, certainly a resume. We have a resume writing critique service. If you have a resume, we're happy to look at it and improve it. If you need a resume, even for very low-time pilots. My son recently went through this. He was a ATP graduate, went to Ameriflight for 1,200 hours more, went to PSA. He became the youngest pilot hired at Southwest Airlines by 18 months, which means he'll be #1 on the list for a year and a half. And he did that. We had a good resume for him when he had 300 hours. And so having a good resume, having a good electronic application, I do critique and improve electronic applications. We do some interview prep primarily for Delta Airlines and some of the flow programs like Delta's Propel. So applications, resumes, but a lot of general counseling. Right now, we're at an important decision point for a lot of pilots. They've got to decide whether to continue or not. They've got to decide whether to start or not. They've got to decide what's next. And they have unique situations. So a lot of times it's worth a phone call to talk about what would be best for you as an individual going forward. You may also have some people you want to convince, spouses, parents, people that are helping you fund this, and they may be less than willing, looking at the industry right now, to have the long view. And perhaps I could help you convince them that this is still a good idea.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today, Kit, and for all of our viewers. Thank you for joining us next Friday at 2 p.m. We're going to be talking about career paths and cargo opportunities and operations with the lead pilot recruiter at Ameriflight, Zeke Zetak. And if you have any questions for Kit, his website, if you guys are, just drag this up a little so you can see it. It is just kitdarby.com, and his contact information is on there. Kit, thank you so much for all of your expertise today.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's do it again soon.
Perfect. Well, have a great weekend, everyone, and fly safe.